Over the following decades, heroin continued to be used in the US and around the world, although it was moved from pharmaceutical manufacture to exclusively black market, continuing to fulfill the beliefs in its association with criminal culture. Outside of the United States, it is still a very common prescription medication in many countries. It's worth noting, though, that the ban on heroin never really reduced heroin use in this country. Use stayed pretty consistent over the past 100 years. In fact, there were even some notable examples of increased use over the decades. The beatnik era of the 1950s and 60s, the Vietnam War led to increased exposure and use in the 1970s and 80s. Heroin has remained prevalent in the US for a long time. So what's changed? Well, in 1959, fentanyl was first synthesized. It is a fully synthetic opioid, meaning it is not related to morphine or any of the compounds in the opium poppy. It is not an opiate. Its structure is noticeably different from those of morphine and heroin. While it's not the first fully synthetic opioid, for example, methadone was developed decades earlier, it is probably the most significant one to talk about. Fentanyl was approved for medical use in the 1960s, and almost immediately there were reports of medical professionals using it non-medically and arguably in unhealthy ways. By the 1970s, fentanyl had entered the street drug supply. When I say street drug supply, I mean non-medical drugs, and I'm primarily referring to heroin, which is sold in powder form. China White is the best example of this. China White is actually alpha-methylfentanyl, and people were using it intentionally, but also overdosing and dying. The thought was that it has a longer duration of action, which people wanted, but it is also significantly more potent than other opioids like heroin and fentanyl, and it, as well as fentanyl and other fentanyl analogs, led to outbreaks of overdose deaths throughout the 1980s, as well as into the 1990s and beyond. Tom Petty even famously sang about China White in the early 90s, and sadly, he himself later died from an overdose of fentanyl analogs. Use of heroin, or what is being bought and sold as quote-unquote heroin, and often containing other drugs, again increased in the late 2000s. There are a lot of theories about why this happened, and they're all very interesting. But that's a whole nother discussion, and I don't think we'll ever really have a great answer. This, though, contributed to the growing public outcry about opioid use at the time, and increased restrictions were placed on traditional heroin supply methods. Effectively, the supply of heroin was reduced and largely destroyed. Which brings us back to fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. Because fentanyl is more potent than heroin or other opioids, it's much easier to transport. It also has the benefit of being fully synthetic, so it does not require poppy fields and all the things that go along with cultivating opium poppies. The ability to do so free from the law, the large amounts of land, sunlight, water, good weather, workers, all of those things. Fentanyl is something that can be made anywhere, even in someone's home. It doesn't take advanced chemistry knowledge or equipment, so it makes sense that it filled the demand for heroin. So let's take a step back here. Why are we now so much worse off than we have been for over 100 years of people using these drugs at essentially identical rates? Why have overdoses on street opioids increased so dramatically in the past few years, if use hasn't really changed much at all? I mentioned the word potency a few times, I think, and potency is the reason. In toxicology, there's a saying that the dose makes the poison, which is why overdoses of anything can be deadly. Now let's compare the opioids we've been discussing, which have driven this long-standing opioid issue. Morphine is considered kind of the standard, the OG opioid, and other opioids have their potency measured in comparison to morphine. Heroin is about 2 times as potent or as strong as morphine. Fentanyl, on the other hand, is about 100 times as potent as morphine, and so 50 times as potent as heroin. So why does that really matter? Well, as we have already noted, heroin has been the long-standing opioid used as a street drug or used non-medically. It was pretty constant for almost a century, and while it is definitely possible to overdose on heroin, overdose rates also stayed pretty constant for about a century. But when fentanyl and other fentanyl analogs showed up, there were increases in overdose. Not small increases. These have been massively significant increases, and this goes back as far as the 1970s. Heroin that is sold on the street has historically been about 50% pure heroin, give or take, which means that if you bought a bag of powdered opioids sold as heroin, it would be about 50% pure heroin and 50% some sort of other cutting agents, fillers, whatever. With heroin supply gone, the replacement was fentanyl. Because it's 50 times as potent as this meant that when it first showed up, the street drugs were about 1% fentanyl and 99% of that other stuff. This has changed in recent years as people have gotten used to fentanyl, and fentanyl being the only available drug. But let's stick with these numbers for simplicity's sake. We're talking about black market drugs here as well. Because they are illegal and relegated to the black market, they do not have the same regulations in place and unlikely to have the same kind of advanced equipment, purity processes, and other things that pharmaceutical grade drugs would have. What I'm trying to say here is that it's not a perfect process, and it's easy for small mistakes to happen, like errors in the percentage. If you were to receive 51% heroin, even 55% heroin because of a mistake in measuring, that wouldn't make a big difference. But a 1% difference in fentanyl makes double the dose. So it's much easier to overdose because that is a big increase. And that's why fentanyl is killing people. And that's not even taking into account that we have other fentanyl analogs, like alpha-methylfentanyl or China white that we talked about before, which add additional and entirely new risks. And now we're seeing drugs that aren't even opioids, things like xylazine, which is a veterinary medicine, ending up in street drugs, and new synthetic opioids, the nitazines, which may be even more potent than fentanyl and other fentanyl analogs. It's completely unpredictable, and it's pretty scary. By banning the supply of heroin, we have left a void for fentanyl to fill. And we went from having a few thousand overdose deaths a year to consistently having tens of thousands. In multiple years, over 100,000 Americans dying every year. While no deaths are okay, this is a big increase. More than a century after Teddy Roosevelt declared an opioid problem in this country, we are somehow much worse off, and we seem to still be getting worse, which is why historical context is important. Hopefully we can learn from it. Hopefully we can rethink our approaches and not repeat the same mistakes of the past.